I remember the exact moment when I realized that the way I'd been fighting anxiety wasn't working. It wasn't some big, dramatic event, no sudden collapse or breakthrough. Instead, it was a quiet frustration, the kind that settles deep in your chest, whispers you're not enough, that this battle is somehow lost before it's even begun. I had been trying so hard to push away the feelings of unease, the racing thoughts, the tightness in my chest that showed up uninvited and unwelcome. Every time anxiety crept in, I would brace myself, tug it away like a stubborn knot in my mind. But the more I resisted, the stronger it grew, and the more exhausted I became. It felt like wrestling with shadows. No matter how much I struggled, anxiety held the upper hand. At first, I thought this was just a sign of weakness. Maybe if I had more willpower, more discipline, this wouldn't happen. So I read every self-help book, tried the breathing exercises, did my best to force myself into calmness. I told myself, you just have to be stronger. But the cycle repeated in cruel loops. Wake up, feel the dread, push it down, pretend it's not there, wait for it to explode again. I was so busy fighting that I never stopped to ask the most important question. What if this fight itself was the problem? This wasn't about some generic stress or an occasional worry that could be tamed with positive thinking. This was anxiety, that relentless, deafening, invisible force that doesn't ask for permission to flood every corner of your mind. The kind that makes you question your own reality, your safety, your worth. And I realized that this wasn't just my story. So many of us are trapped in the same exhausting cycle, trying to outrun anxiety, mask it, silence it, only to find ourselves sinking deeper. What if the solution isn't about fighting the anxiety? What if it's something more nuanced, something most people don't talk about? I started noticing that every well-meaning piece of advice I encountered focused on pushing anxiety away rather than understanding it. And in that avoidance, I sensed a cruel paradox. By shoving anxiety aside, I was feeding the very thing I feared the most. It's a bitter, uncomfortable truth that almost no one wants to admit. We live in a culture that celebrates toughness, grit, and mental resilience as if they were shields against emotional struggle. But what happens when those shields trap us in a war inside ourselves that can't be won by brute force? That's what I want to explore with you. Not the empty slogans or quick fixes, but the real, often painful truths that lie beneath the surface of anxiety. This isn't going to be an easy conversation because the truths we need to hear are not polished or pretty. They might challenge what you believe about yourself, your control, and what healing looks like. But I promise you, they are liberating. Because once you stop trying to be the hero who defeats anxiety by brute strength, you open the door to becoming the real hero who understands it, who sees it not as an enemy, but as a teacher. I know how confusing and overwhelming this feels. How anxiety can seem like a trap with no exit. How lonely the nights can be when your mind won't rest. And how every attempt to just get over it somehow leaves you more stuck. But I also know that there is a way forward. Not by denying your experience, not by pretending you're fine, but by leaning into the discomfort, shining a light on what's really going on inside your brain and heart. In the next moments, I want to share with you 8 uncomfortable but deeply freeing truths I've come to learn. These truths might unsettle you. They might make you pause and reconsider what you thought you knew about anxiety. But they aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to release you. Because when you stop fighting the storm inside, you start to understand how to dance with it. I'm not asking you to change overnight or to suddenly be stronger. I'm inviting you to see anxiety from a different angle, to open a new door inside yourself, to feel less like a victim of your emotions and more like a traveler on a journey through a complex landscape where strength doesn't come from resistance, but from understanding. So before we begin, see this as a quiet moment of permission, to be real with yourself, to hold space for your experience, and to step gently into a conversation that could change everything. The battle you've been fighting isn't against anxiety itself. It's against the way we've been taught to fight it. And the true path to freedom starts with a different kind of courage. The courage to see anxiety not as a foe, but as a part of your story waiting to be understood. There was a night when my chest tightened so suddenly that it felt like an invisible hand was squeezing relentlessly. I tried to breathe deeply, hoping to calm the storm brewing inside. But panic only gained momentum. At that moment, I wasn't battling a nameless enemy. I was confronting intricate neural pathways that had been rewired years ago. Anxiety, as I came to understand more clearly, operates less like a foe to defeat and more like an automatic response written into the brain's circuitry. This revelation lifted a veil I hadn't known was clouding my perspective. I began to explore how episodes of dread aren't random intrusions, but conditioned reactions, shaped by past moments of fear or threat. It fascinated me how the amygdala, that almond-shaped cluster of neurons deep within, acts as an emotional sentinel, sometimes misfiring alarms even when true danger isn't present. This explained why rational thinking often feels powerless during overwhelming waves of nervousness. The brain is following a deep-rooted script based on survival instincts rather than conscious choice. Once I grasped this, a shift surfaced. The battle against anxious feelings was futile if I didn't address these neurological patterns. To go deeper, I started noticing how subtle cues in everyday life, like a glance, an unexpected email, or a social setting, could unknowingly trigger this automatic distress signal. It was as if my mind had learned to associate ordinary, neutral moments with threat, a misconnection that only care and nuanced attention could begin to untangle. Through conversations with therapists and reading neuroscience research, I discovered that these fear responses are not fixed destinies. Neuroplasticity, the brain's uncanny ability to rewire itself, means that new, healthier pathways can form over time. The key, however, isn't brute force or sheer willpower. It's gentle curiosity and patience. Instead of resisting or trying to suppress anxious sensations, I was learning to sit with them, observe them without judgment, and allow my mind to gradually reshape its reactions. It reminded me vividly of gardening. If I tried to yank out a stubborn weed too harshly, its roots would dig deeper, spreading wider. But if I patiently loosened the soil, tended around it carefully, and nourished the nearby plants, the weed's hold would weaken. Similarly, by acknowledging discomfort rather than fleeing from it, I began nourishing new neural connections that offered calm, balance, and safety. In one pivotal moment, I tried an experiment. After a stressful day, when unease crept in, I didn't rush for distractions. Instead, I closed my eyes, breathed slowly, and invited the sensations to reveal themselves. It was terrifying at first, like dipping into cold water, but also strangely liberating. Each anxious pulse became a signal carrying information, rather than an enemy demanding to dominate. Conversations with close friends deepened this insight. One shared how embracing anxious feelings allowed her to catch early warning signs and choose responses with more control, rather than feeling overwhelmed by automatic spirals. Another described how journaling about these experiences both externalized her inner tension and helped trace patterns, revealing triggers she hadn't suspected. Meanwhile, I noticed how societal messages about toughness and just getting over it failed miserably here. Our culture often frames emotional struggles as battles of weakness, which fosters shame and isolation. But learning the science behind anxiety cultivated compassion. Instead of berating myself for slipping into fear, I recognized that these were reflexive echoes from hardwired survival systems, ones designed to protect, albeit poorly calibrated now. Now, consider how this applies when unexpected waves arise, like walking into a crowded event or hearing bad news. Instead of bracing to escape or tough it out, imagine simply acknowledging the rising tension with kindness. This subtle internal shift can dismantle the power anxiety holds. Like a flashlight in a dark tunnel, the act of paying gentle attention illuminates feared sensations and reduces their mystique. Another crucial layer is understanding that emotional regulation isn't about eliminating anxiety, but learning to navigate its currents skillfully. Athletes don't aim to erase muscle fatigue. Instead, they develop techniques to perform fluidly despite discomfort. Similarly, cultivating awareness of bodily signals, practicing grounding exercises, and engaging in mindful pauses build resilience not by erasing nerves, but by adapting to their presence. Reflecting on this journey, I came to see anxiety not as a roadblock, but as a deeply informative map, highlighting areas within where healing awaits. The process demands bravery, not bravado, but the quiet courage to meet oneself fully, tend inner wounds thoughtfully, and rewrite conditioned responses through patience and presence. This approach transformed how I relate to anxious moments. Instead of seeing them as battles lost or personal failures, I meet them as moments rich with insight and opportunity. The tightness in the chest is no longer a tyrant, but an early signal, guiding me toward gentler choices and deeper self-understanding. It's as if I moved from a war zone to a dialogue, from resistance to connection. By approaching inner unrest with compassion rather than force, I discovered a profound freedom. This freedom comes not from the absence of struggle, but from discovering how to embrace complexity rather than deny it. My journey isn't about eradicating unease, but learning how to live in harmony with it, transforming discomfort into a catalyst for growth. As this perspective unfolded within me, fear lost some of its grip. The tangled web of past associations gently unwound, replaced by a different rhythm, one of acceptance paired with intention. And it's this rhythm that opens the path to lasting peace, beyond quick fixes or hollow reassurances. It's the rhythm of understanding, patience, and above all, an unwavering commitment to treat oneself tenderly through every twist of the process. I remember a time when my anxiety felt like a distant thunderstorm, its rumble barely perceptible but ever present on the horizon. Curious and desperate to understand how I kept getting caught in its unpredictable downpour, I began paying attention not to the intensity of the storm itself, but to how the environment around me influenced whether it erupted or passed unnoticed. I realized that anxiety often thrives in the gaps between actions and awareness, those moments when attention drifts away or uncertainty whispers louder than clarity. It was in these quieter intervals that the tension found fertile ground to grow. One afternoon, as I sat in a bustling cafe, I noticed how the cacophony of sounds, clinking cups, murmured conversations, footsteps, created a sort of sensory overload that subtly tightened my chest. The external chaos mirrored an internal escalator moving upward without control. Instead of shrinking back or trying to mute the noise with headphones or distractions, I chose to become fully present with the experience. I focused deeply on textures, smells, and the vibrant energy pulsating just beyond my skin. Paradoxically, by immersing myself fully in the moment, the tension ebbed, leaving space to breathe. That day, I began grasping how anxiety's power often depends on the way we relate to the sensory world around us. This sparked an exploration of how everyday environments shape emotional responses. My apartment, once a safe haven, sometimes became a prison when clutter or unpredictable sounds distracted me, intensifying unease. I noticed that reorganizing my space and creating predictable routines grounded my nervous system, providing a subconscious message of order amidst internal chaos. The process reminded me of tuning a musical instrument, small adjustments yielding resonance and harmony. That simplicity translated into a sense of subtle control, weakening anxiety's grip without a single battle fought. One weekend, a close friend invited me hiking. The thought of being surrounded by unfamiliar terrain initially filled me with dread. Yet, as we ascended through the woods, the rhythm of footsteps on the earth, the steadiness of the rising sun, and the weight of fresh air began to recalibrate something inside. There, away from screens and schedules, anxiety's voice softened into the background hum of distant wildlife. Witnessing raw nature's unhurried tempo allowed me to rename that restless energy, not as an opponent, but as a messenger signaling neglected parts of self needing attention and healing. The results rippled beyond the hike. I realized I could find similar peace anytime by slowing down and syncing with natural rhythms. Another turning point arrived unexpectedly during an evening when sleep escaped me. Rather than tossing and turning or negotiating with thought spirals, I reached for my journal, spilling ink onto pages with reckless honesty. I refrained from sanitizing emotions or filtering fears. Instead, raw vulnerability poured out, shattered hopes, simmering frustrations, and flickers of hope naming themselves aloud. The act of externalizing this storm on paper sometimes felt like releasing pressure valves that had dangerously built up inside. Furthermore, it crafted a visible trail tracing how anxiety blurred perspectives and magnified shadows. Writing became a companion rather than an escape, a tool to disentangle complexity without judgment. A few weeks later, I encountered a surprising lesson in an art class. Tasked with painting something that represented my current state, I hesitated until colors and brushstrokes began to flow without logic or expectation. The chaotic swirls of dark and light, sharp edges softened by curved lines, embodied internal contradictions I hadn't confronted head-on before. Observing this physical manifestation felt like holding a mirror to intangible emotions, transforming invisible turmoil into a palpable landscape. Sharing the artwork with the group led to stories of resilience woven through struggle, reminding me that anxiety is a thread in human experience, not a marker of failure. One evening, as dusk draped the city, I stood on a balcony watching people rush past, each carrying untold burdens. In that moment, a quiet awareness dawned. Everyone wrestles with unseen storms. This realization seeded compassion and dismantled isolation's fortress. Experiencing shared fragility softened my expectations of myself. Factors like genetics, upbringing, and life circumstances intertwine to shape emotional landscapes far beyond personal control. Recognizing this web lightened the unbearable pressure to fix everything alone. Now, imagine how this applies when you face moments of overwhelming expectation, say, stepping into an unfamiliar room or confronting a challenging conversation. Instead of bracing for impact, try engaging your senses to ground yourself. Feel the solidity beneath your feet, notice temperature shifts, or identify subtle scents. These simple anchor points act like lifelines, tethering scattered thoughts and emotions. They create a sanctuary inside where safety is rebuilt, paving the way for calmer engagement. Connecting with creative outlets, whether through journaling, art, or movement, births new pathways to process feelings that words alone struggle to capture. Preparing these channels requires courage to be imperfect and vulnerable, but each step dismantles anxiety's fortress brick by brick. Small rituals, like lighting a candle or savoring a warm cup, can open unexpected doorways towards self-kindness and presence. In weaving these experiences together, I understood that anxiety's overwhelming force often diminishes when met with mindful attentiveness and intentional connection, both inward and outward. The landscape of emotional regulation, far less linear than I imagined, flourishes through nuanced interplay between environment, body, and mind. Approaching anxiety not as an adversary, but as part of an intricate dance enriches the journey, revealing resilience residing in subtle shifts rather than grand gestures. It invites us to craft courage from the willingness to explore discomfort with open hands, gradually finding balance in the ever-flowing currents of our inner worlds. The evening air was heavy with unspoken tension as I sat across from Maya in her cozy living room, sunlight fading through the curtains and casting long shadows on the walls. She had invited me over to share her story, one that carried the weight of years spent wrestling with internal chaos that nobody else could see. As Maya spoke, her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the raw vulnerability of revealing a truth often buried underneath layers of stoic defense. I used to believe my feelings were something to fix, an illness I had to cure so I could finally be normal, she confessed, her hands twisting nervously. Every time those emotions surged, I tried pushing them away, pretending they didn't exist. Her admission felt like peeling back a fragile layer, exposing the exhaustion that prolonged denial inevitably breeds. Maya recounted a pivotal evening when that strategy collapsed entirely. Alone in her apartment, overwhelmed and spiraling, she reached a breaking point where denial no longer sufficed. Instead of reacting with familiar resistance, she hesitated, curious about what would happen if she gave space to her discomfort. A quiet whisper within coaxed her to stop tethering herself to fear and instead invite it to be present. With shaking hands and shallow breath, she allowed herself to simply watch the sensations. No labels, no judgments, just an observing presence. The experience wasn't immediate relief, though. Waves of trembling and tightness washed over her, making her want to flee into the safety of distraction. Yet, as minutes passed with continued openness, something subtle shifted. The overwhelming urge to escape softened, and in its place emerged an unexpected clarity, a gentle lightness behind the weight. For the first time, I saw that my feelings were messengers, not enemies. Maya shared softly, her eyes glistening. Witnessing her courage sparked reflections in me about the profound impact of embracing emotional experience over avoidance. Often, society equates vulnerability with frailty, and so many of us learn to armor ourselves with suppression and denial. Yet, the true revolution lies in adopting a posture of radical acceptance towards our inner storms. When we welcome discomfort, we break the cycle of automatic defense, opening pathways to healing that force and resistance can never build. Not long after, I found myself navigating an early morning rainstorm during a city commute. The slick streets slowed traffic, and chaos reigned with honking horns and hurried footsteps. Under usual circumstances, this scenario would ignite my nerves, tightening my chest, and speeding my thoughts toward worst-case scenarios. But on this particular day, I consciously tuned into the sensory experience instead, how cold droplets traced paths on my face, how the earth smelled saturated and alive. This shift in attention acted like landing gear in turbulent skies, anchoring me safely within a moment that previously triggered flight mode. The next step in this unfolding understanding involved exploring how emotions manifest physically and how attention redirected to bodily sensations can dispel the fog of distress. Engaging in practices that cultivate somatic awareness became pivotal. In gentle yoga sessions, I learned to notice the subtle chatter beneath tension, the tightness in my shoulders, the flutter behind my sternum, the way my breath shortened without my permission. Instead of tightening the grip, I relaxed into these messages, receiving them as guidance rather than warnings. One afternoon during guided meditation, I encountered a moment that struck me deeply. As shadows danced within my closed eyelids, sensations emerged that I had diligently ignored for years. Instead of trying to silence or change them, I held space, akin to cradling a fragile bird wounded yet trustworthy. Gradually, the resistance melted into a quiet companionship with my own experience. It felt less like taming a wild stallion and more like learning the rhythm of a hesitant heartbeat. Building on this experiential foundation, I recognized how narrative plays a formidable role in either sustaining or alleviating inner turmoil. The stories we tell ourselves about our emotional experiences craft meaning that either confines or liberates. In conversations with friends and therapists, I began reconstructing the narrative from "I am broken because these feelings arise" to "these feelings signal unspoken parts of myself seeking attention." This linguistic shift reshaped my relationship with emotional distress, transforming it from a burden carried in isolation to an evolving dialogue with the self. Moreover, I noticed how embracing imperfections and processing emotions extends beyond solitary moments. Sharing honest disclosures with trusted others forms a collective sanctuary that reduces stigma and fosters communal healing. Hearing Maya articulate her journey with such raw honesty made me realize the bravery embedded in vulnerability, that opening our stories creates ripples, releasing pent-up tension not only within but across our circles. At times, I find the metaphor of a river useful to illustrate this process. Emotions are currents continuously flowing. They might surge unpredictably, swirl into eddies, or calm to gentle streams. Attempting to dam or divert the river often summons more forceful pushback. Instead, when we lean into its movement, riding waves rather than fighting tides, we gain insight into its depths and direction. This patience with the ever-changing emotional landscape ultimately yields resilience. Now, consider how this applies when you face moments shadowed by intense unease, perhaps an upcoming decision or confrontation. Instead of grappling for immediate control, give yourself permission to observe the unfolding sensations. Whisper to yourself that it's acceptable to feel unsettled, and invite the sensation to coexist with any plans you need to make. This small but deliberate act rewires the experience from a hazard zone into curious terrain ripe with possibility. In embracing our full emotional spectrum without haste or aversion, we step away from cycles of self-judgment. We cultivate a sanctuary within, a boundless space where every shade and tremor has its place. This space does not erase difficulty, but transforms it into a canvas for profound understanding and growth. Through this journey, healing blossoms, not as a destination reached by force, but as a landscape explored patiently with heart wide open. I once found myself wandering through an unfamiliar neighborhood late in the evening, the streets dimly lit by flickering lamps and shadows stretching long across cracked sidewalks. Anxiety often thrived in such uncertain surroundings for me. Every sound amplified, each passerby's glance carrying unintended menace. On that night, however, something shifted. Instead of hurrying past, I paused and let my gaze settle on the patterns painted by the streetlights, the dance of light and dark weaving a silent story across peeling walls. What struck me was how my attention adjusted, moving away from the usual surge of worry toward a subtle appreciation of textures and rhythms around me. With each breath, the tense knot in my stomach loosened, almost as if the city's muted pulse aligned with my own internal beat. It was as if I'd discovered a hidden refuge among the quiet contrasts, a refuge created not by escape, but by embracing my place in the world's ebb and flow. That night taught me that fear often recedes when we engage senses beyond mental chatter, intertwining presence with surroundings in an unhurried dialogue. On another occasion, I encountered a storm, not outside, but within a heated argument with a loved one. Our voices climbed, sharp and urgent, words cutting deeper than intended. Usually, conflict would send me spiraling into anxious self-protection, shutting down to guard against imagined rejection. But that day, amid swelling tension, I chose to lean into vulnerability's raw edge, narrating simply, "I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I need a moment." The act of naming my turbulence softened the moment unexpectedly. It created a space where both of us could breathe, recalibrate, and connect beyond the noise. This experience underlined the power of transparency and emotional honesty in moments of friction. Vulnerability can dismantle walls that anxiety often constructs around relationships, transforming perceived threats into bridges of understanding. It reminded me that openness doesn't signify weakness but strengthens bonds by inviting truth into places usually shadowed by fear and avoidance. Somewhere along this journey, I realized how physical movement became a silent ally in untangling anxious webs. I began to explore dance, not as performance, but as a language of body and soul speaking aloud what words could not reach. When I surrendered to rhythm, the sway of limbs and the pulse beneath skin, I encountered freedom from repetitive worries confined in my mind. The fluidity of motion rewired circuits loaded with tension, offering release and communion with a part of myself often ignored. One night after class, I sat alone by a river, its flowing water a constant, soothing presence. Watching currents swirl and eddy, I saw a metaphor for my own emotional storms, sometimes raging, sometimes calm, but always moving. The river did not fight its bends or try to seize control. It surrendered to progression and change. It dawned on me that adopting such flexibility within, letting feelings rise, fall, and transform without resistance, could dissipate anxiety's oppressive grip. In another vivid moment, a deep breath pulled me from a spiral triggered by an unexpected phone call. Rather than suppressing the surge, I traced the dryness coating my tongue, the faint tremor in my hands, the warm rush flooding my cheeks. Attending to these subtle signals rooted me, turning my focus outward from swirling fears inward toward tactile markers of presence. After a pause, I whispered reassuringly, "You're safe right now." The phrase was not an empty platitude but a needed anchor, reorienting me within the fluctuating waves of emotion. Further down this path, I discovered the transformative effect of creative storytelling, not just as consumers or passive reporters of events, but as active authors shaping inner narratives. Penning letters to my anxious self, imagining dialogues with fear, and crafting alternative endings freed me from unchallenged scripts pinned by past conditioning. These narratives acted as portals to reimagine identity beyond limitations, inviting empowerment and fresh perspective. One afternoon, while hiking through a misty forest, I came upon an ancient tree gnarled and weathered by countless seasons. Its resilience lay not in perfection, but in the authenticity marked by scars and growth rings. I sat beneath its sprawling branches, absorbing lessons written in bark textures and leaf patterns, a living testament to endurance through cyclical change. The tree seemed to whisper, Strength exists in adaptability, not rigid resistance. Absorbing this, I recognized that my struggles, too, could mature into sources of wisdom rather than innate flaws. Now, when unexpected tension leaks into my day, maybe a challenging email or an uncomfortable social moment, I pause to reorient myself through sensory grounding. The smooth curve of a coffee mug in my hand, the scent of fresh rain outside, the gentle hum of distant city life, all weave a fabric of stability against chaos. These minutes of slow reclamation transform scattered thoughts into coherence, threading peace through unsettled spaces. There's a transformative power in weaving mindfulness into ordinary moments, turning routine gestures into ceremonies of care and presence. Lighting a candle before journaling or savoring each bite during meals isn't just habit. It's an intimate offering of kindness towards self amid fluctuating emotional climates. Over time, such rituals create safe harbors, small anchor points that tether us to steadiness. Another shift unfolded when I recognized the communal nature of recovery. Sharing honest reflections with trusted friends or support groups illuminated collective wounds and resilience. I realized that vulnerability, far from isolating, constructs a mosaic of shared humanity, an invisible web of connection that fortifies us even in solitude. As I trace these transformations, I see that anxiety's hold loosens not through grand, singular agents, but through a constellation of small, attentive acts, moments where presence, vulnerability, creativity, and connection intertwine. Each choice to meet feeling and circumstance without avoidance carves a path away from alienation, guiding us home to ourselves with gentleness and courage. There was a moment during a drizzly autumn afternoon when I found myself sitting on a creaky bench in a quiet park, watching leaves tumble across the wet pavement. An unexpected tension gripped my stomach, twisting into an uncomfortable knot that resisted any attempt at mere distraction or control. Instead of rising to escape or distract, I chose to examine this sensation closely, as if it were a peculiar visitor knocking softly on my door. At first, the unfamiliar action stirred a swirl of resistance, but gradually, my curiosity deepened. I noticed how this knot wasn't an isolated entity, but a complex interplay of memories, biases, and unspoken stories buried beneath layers of habit. During that observation, a voice inside me whispered, "What if this discomfort carries its own kind of wisdom?" It wasn't an invitation to surrender passively, but an encouragement to listen actively. I started tracing back fragments of times when similar physical sensations had appeared unexpectedly and wondered about the underlying threads weaving through those moments. This gentle inquiry into my internal landscape marked a departure from my usual reactive stance and beckoned toward a richer self-awareness. One afternoon, as I meandered through a bustling market, the overwhelming sights and sounds usually sparked unrest beneath my ribs. But on this occasion, instead of shielding myself, I allowed myself to absorb the sensations without labeling them urgently as threats. I observed the bright fabric of scarves, the chatter rippling between vendors, the scent of freshly ground spices, and how they all mingled in a symphony of living textures. My nervous system didn't calm immediately, but the tension began to ebb as I anchored my attention in descriptive observation. It reminded me how engaging with moments fully, even if initially uncomfortable, reclaims authority over fragmented attention. A few evenings later, I engaged in a conversation with a friend who described similar struggles. As we shared, I sensed a shift not only in her words but in the spaces between them, a pause where acceptance blossomed. She spoke about how intermittent moments of peace, however brief, became lifelines during turbulent times. That dialogue underscored how embracing the transient nature of uneasy emotions can foster resilience, allowing us to flow rather than freeze in distress. I found reassurance in recognizing that fragmented experiences are parts of a larger mosaic constantly reshaped by our willingness to engage. During solitary walks along misty trails, I noticed how the Earth's uneven paths mirrored internal fluctuations, both inviting attention and gentleness. Sometimes, a loose stone underfoot forced me to recalibrate steps carefully, mirroring how emotional instability calls for patience and mindful presence. The tactile awareness of my feet, the scent of damp wood, and the scrape of wind through leaves grounded me differently than mental reframing alone ever could. This embodied connection offered a practical tool to tame escalating distress through immersion in sensory reality. Later, I experimented with journaling techniques focused on sensory detail instead of abstract explanations. Writing about the temperature of air against my skin or the taste of bitter coffee created intricate tapestries that transcended simple narratives of anxiety. This process felt like cultivating a garden of awareness, each description planting seeds of insight that sprouted understanding over time. The tactile nature of ink meeting paper paradoxically brought a deeply physical connection to intangible emotional currents. In a moment of unexpected clarity, I recognized how societal expectations of constant productivity fuel internal friction. During an exhausting workweek, the push to maintain relentless momentum jarred against my nervous system's cries for rest. Rather than condemning myself for fatigue, I reframed these signals as essential alerts demanding recalibration. I carved out deliberate pauses, filling them with sensory richness, soft music, warm tea, the gentle hum of distant voices, which acted as antidotes rather than escape routes. This created a sustainable rhythm balancing action and recovery. One night, I noticed how soundscapes influenced my internal state profoundly. Listening to the crackling fireplace mingled with whispered raindrops, my mind slowed, allowing scattered thoughts to settle. The subtle layering of auditory stimuli became a sanctuary, suggesting how carefully crafted environments support emotional regulation beyond cognitive effort. I began curating similar sensory experiences intentionally, recognizing their potent role in shifting mood and internal balance. Now, picture facing a moment when your mind races uncontrollably and tension threatens to unravel your composure. Practicing anchoring in finely detailed sensory input, the texture of fabric brushing your skin, the subtle scent lingering in the air, serves as a conduit back to centeredness. This technique grounds scattered attention, encouraging the mind and body to synchronize gently, diluting overwhelm with immersive, present-focused engagement. In weaving these threads, I found that transcending habitual mental loops requires surrendering control not through passivity, but through deliberate presence. It's in this nuanced encounter, embracing fluctuating signals from body and environment alike, where transformation unfolds, an invitation to foster resilience through sensory awareness, granting the restless mind moments of clarity and calm. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself stepping into a quieter chamber of my mind, where the cacophony of earlier struggles softens into a rhythm both familiar and surprising. It's as though I've been wandering through a dense forest, initially pushing against every thorn and bramble with weary hands, only to discover that the path opens wider when I lower my arms and learn to trust the terrain beneath my feet. The very tension that once seemed a merciless adversary begins revealing itself as a nuanced companion, complex in its presence, yet intimately connected to the deeper movements inside me. In conversations with myself that I never imagined having, I've sensed a subtle shift in how uncertainty and discomfort coexist with a growing sense of agency. It's not a linear unfolding but a dance between shadows and light, moments where resistance quietly yields to acknowledgement, and where the pulse of vulnerability echoes as a sacred signal rather than a silent indictment. I've found that the narrative we carry about our inner storms influences not only how we endure them, but how we begin to converse with their presence. The dialogue deepens, no longer scripted by fear, but improvised with tenderness. I recall nights when the familiar tightening moved beyond mere sensation into a language of its own, a rhythmic thrum weaving through neurons and sinew, pressing me to listen more closely to patterns beneath the surface. There is an artistry in these subtle cues, an invitation to translate bodily whispers into something comprehensible and ultimately transformative. This journey is less a conquest than an apprenticeship in self-awareness, where patience becomes a trusted guide and attentiveness serves as both shield and compass. Walking this path has revealed that the interplay between mind and body forms a tapestry rich with hidden textures, each thread offering clues to the vibrant landscape of emotional complexity we inhabit. It's as if the self is a manuscript in constant revision, with chapters oscillating between fragility and strength, fragmentation and wholeness. Tending to this evolving story requires gentleness, an openness to nuance and contradiction that challenges simplistic notions of control. This understanding permeates not only moments of quiet reflection, but also the chaotic intersections of daily life, where fear once held unyielding sway. I am struck by the way subtle shifts in attention ripple through experience like stones cast upon still water, generating concentric circles of awareness that eventually touch distant shores of acceptance. These ripples encourage me to embrace the fullness of being human, with all its imperfections and mysteries, rather than cling to the illusion of seamless mastery. The progression unfolds not as sudden revelation, but as a series of quieter awakenings, each one layering resilience upon the last, creating a foundation firm enough to support vulnerability without fracture. This evolving relationship with inner turbulence carries within it a paradox. By releasing the impulse to dominate or erase difficult feelings, the ground beneath us grows sturdier. The pressure that once threatened to erode confidence softens, reshaped by an emergent trust in the self's capacity to hold complexity without collapse. In this space, the mind's restless currents become navigable waters where navigation replaces resistance, and balance emerges from fluidity rather than rigidity. I find these reflections weaving seamlessly with the realization that transformation thrives in moments when we allow ourselves to fully inhabit paradox, holding strength and surrender side by side, courage and uncertainty intertwined. This alchemy transforms what once seemed an insurmountable wall into a threshold, beckoning us toward horizons shaped not by escape, but surrender, not by fighting, but flowing. As I sit with these sensations, I am reminded that the road ahead is not a straight ascent, but a winding river, ever-changing in depth and velocity. The process invites continual re-engagement with ourselves, asking us to meet discomfort not with dismissal, but with renewed curiosity and openness. This ongoing dialogue between tension and release becomes a sacred practice, an act of reverence for the ever-shifting landscape of inner life. I invite you to sense this unfolding with me, the quiet power residing in these tides of transformation. It is not a destination waiting to be reached, but a living experience we cultivate together, one breath, one moment, one tender encounter at a time. Nearing the edge of this chapter, I am poised with you on the cusp of a deeper revelation, one that honors the complexity we've explored while opening a door toward a profound awakening yet to come. I've come to realize that true transformation never arrives fully formed. It emerges quietly through the spaces where we stop resisting and begin listening. There was a moment, long ago and yet vivid still, when I sat alone beneath a sky woven with fading light, heart pounding not from panic, but from surrender. The night whispered truths that eluded me in daylight, that peace doesn't sprout from conquering discomfort, but from learning to embrace its presence without hostility. In that stillness, I encountered an unexpected ally, vulnerability dressed not in defeat, but in radical honesty. We often fear unveiling our complicated emotions, shielding ourselves behind bravado or avoidance. Yet beneath those veils, there lives a profound courage patiently waiting for us to lean in. It's a courage born from accepting every fragment of our experience as worthy of attention and tenderness, even the parts that ripple with unease and uncertainty. When I met those parts with openness, the hard edges softened, and clarity began to seep in like dawn after a long night. There was a day I recall, walking through a quiet street thick with autumn scent, colors melting into one another under chilled light. Instead of rushing past the stirring unease that crept up my chest, I paused, inviting dialogue with those restless sensations. I thought of anxiety not as an adversary shouting in my mind, but as a messenger who had been speaking in a language I hadn't yet learned to comprehend. The shift wasn't immediate, but it changed the entire terrain beneath my feet. It was as though the ground became steady because I stopped waging war against the wind. Through countless smaller moments like this, I discovered something astonishing. Freedom often unfolds through patience with ourselves, through allowing emotional landscapes to reveal their intricacies without judgment or escape. Healing revealed itself as a delicate art, a dance where presence replaces control and compassion rises when expectation falls away. The mind's storms don't vanish overnight. Stillness doesn't mean passivity, but a choice to meet each wave with curiosity, to lower the shields that inadvertently feed turmoil. My understanding deepened as I witnessed others struggling, recognizing how collective narratives fiercely shape internal realities. I remember a friend recounting how embracing uncertainty instead of fleeing cultivated resilience born of acceptance rather than resistance. Their story echoed alongside my own, weaving a tapestry of human experience where shared vulnerability becomes a portal to connection and healing. What transformed me most was embracing paradox, the willingness to own fragility while embracing strength, holding fear tenderly, yet stepping forward boldly. These are not opposites, but intertwined threads that weave a fabric strong enough to wrap around the rawest parts of ourselves. I came to see that growth sprouts from surrendering the illusion of absolute mastery. In those moments when control loosened, I found steadiness. The body became a trusted guide in this unfolding. Breath held stories, tension carried memories, and sensations led me toward grounding that intellect alone couldn't provide. I learned to listen to subtle whispers beneath anxiety's roar, a tightening of muscles, a shift in heartbeat, a language of embodiment that invited care and presence. Engaging with these signals cultivated resilience not by overpowering distress, but by harmonizing with its rhythm. Now, I see that the path forward isn't paved with grand victories or heroic escapes, but with gentle invitations to witness, accept, and respond with kindness. It involves creating spaces inside and outside ourselves where emotions can surface without fear, where complexity is honored, and where imperfect humanity is celebrated. Each intentional breath, each mindful pause, each moment of honest self-recognition serves as a step out of isolation and toward freedom. As I reflect, I invite you to join me in reconsidering the battle we are tempted to fight. What if the true power rests not in defeating discomfort, but in befriending it? What if the courage we seek emerges when we give ourselves permission to feel fully and to choose compassion over condemnation? I believe these questions hold the seeds of profound change. Our scars and storms do not diminish our worth. They testify to our endurance and depth. When we shift from resistance to acceptance, we cultivate a sanctuary within where transformation quietly blossoms. So let us move forward, not as warriors seeking conquest, but as tender gardeners tending the rich, fertile soil of our lives. Together, we can learn to dance with shadows, to cradle our fears, and to rise gently into the light of renewed possibility.